Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday of the first week of class. I hope everybody had a great first week. So today I wanted to go through a few topics with you, and then as always, we'll open up for questions. So I will be watching the questions and reading questions as they come in real time, answering those questions as I always do. So again, I really appreciate you joining me today and having a conversation about where we are with several specific projects with the district. So a couple things I want to talk about first are personnel related. So our new Vice Chancellor for Human Resources, Dr. Ryan Medlin, began on January 12th. So Dr. Medlin will join the other Vice Chancellors as they hold town hall meetings on campus. And so I hope everyone will have an opportunity to meet Dr. Medlin soon. As far as her career background, just a couple things to mention that I think are important. She had a very long career at College of the Canyons, where she ultimately served as Vice President for Human Resources. She has great experience in bargaining, interest-based bargaining, as you know, that we use specifically, working with bargaining units, resolving challenges, grievances, other issues. So I'm excited that Dr. Medlin's here. I think you will find that she's a great partner. She'll be very helpful in working through any employment issues we may have, helping to recruit and onboard personnel. So I just want to make sure that our district team knew that Dr. Medlin was on board and that you will probably you'll probably see her soon at a campus. So that's the first personnel thing. You might recall about a year ago, I talked to you about a chief integrity officer position, or what kind of used to be called an ombudsman position. And the term ombuds is sort of an older term. And so you see a lot of universities and large community college district use terminology that is chief integrity officer. And so I'm keeping my promise to you now that I have the Vice Chancellor for Human Resources on board. The next move I'll be making is to hire somebody to serve as the Chief Integrity Officer. And so what does that mean? So the Chief Integrity Officer's job is multi-purpose. Their first and primary function is to be an ambassador for all of our employees, to help resolve challenges at the lowest possible level. Now, I know and you know that sometimes we can't resolve every challenge, every problem, every issue at the lowest common denominator. However, instead of everything escalating to a more formalized process, the Ombuds Chief Integrity Office gives us the opportunity to try to resolve things informally. So typically a person that is hired as a Chief Integrity Officer has years of experience in mediation, even though in the way we use mediation, it's not necessarily a bargaining unit mediation that you might think of if there's an issue with a CBA or an employment contract. This really means mediating two parties and trying to resolve that challenge at the lowest common denominator. One of the things that really helps in the entire sort of HR process is if we can resolve issues at the lowest common denominator, then they're not going towards human resources. We're not spending more time and investing more time with human resources staff solving issues that hopefully we could resolve at the lowest common level. So I've talked about this before in webinars. I've talked about it in multiple town halls. I just wanted you to know that now that the Chief Human Resource Officer is on board, the Chief Integrity Officer is the next position we'll be looking to fill. That position, just to remind everyone, will report directly to the Chancellor. That position can't report to HR or another Vice Chancellor because what we don't want is any inherent or implied bias. So in other words, that position is wholly separate from any human resource process. So it's important that it reports directly to me. That way we ensure that there's no bias and that when that individual meets and talks with employees, that they're doing so from a very unbiased platform. The other thing that position does is work with leaders and faculty classified throughout the district to teach things like de-escalation techniques, conflict resolution techniques. Again, the more we can invest in training and educating people, maybe those things don't even come to the Ombuds Chief Integrity Officer position. But again, there are several districts in the state of California. Peralta Community College, interestingly enough, is hiring a new ombudsperson, I'm actually using some of the information in that job description in the job description that I'm kind of putting together. So if you're interested, you can go out and look at Peralta Community College District. They're hiring the first ever, I actually think they're calling that an ombuds position, but nonetheless, it's a position that several districts in the state use. My colleagues that I've spoken to who have that position really seem to believe that it helps alleviate issues. It allows HR to focus on more complex issues and, quite frankly, is a more expeditious resolution to challenges. So I just wanted you to know that change is coming as well. Again, now that the new Vice Chancellor for Human Resources is on board, Chief Integrity Officer will be the next hire. I'll also mention, just so people know, that we're just about ready to launch the search at Bakersfield College for the next permanent president. That search will go live probably in the next week or so. Next week, there are campus town hall meetings, so the campus community has an opportunity to provide input into the knowledge, skills, abilities, traits that the campus wants to see in the next permanent president. The idea is that committee's work will be done during the spring, and then at the May 2026 board meeting, we'll take the finalists to the board for approval. So just know that search will be starting. The committee has already been formed. We're using ACCT, American Community College Trustees, has a search service. I've worked with them before in other states. They have a very regimented search process. So ACCT is assisting with the search. And again, we expect this to culminate with a recommendation to the board in May 2026 to hire the new permanent president of Bakersfield College. So that is essentially the main personnel things at the district, and then of course the chief executive officer position at Bakersfield. And then just to remind everyone, now permanent president Menares, Primavera Menares was installed in November as the permanent president of Porterville College. And so I appreciate the work that committee did. And again, my congratulations to permanent president Menares as she leads Porterville College into the next iteration of our strategic plan. I wanted to shift now from personnel before we get into questions and talk about the board meeting yesterday, because I want to talk about the district audit. There are a lot of changes that are underway right now, and I want to be very specific with you and talk about why that's happening. I want to talk about the audit in general terms. If you want to see a copy of the audit, it's a public document. It's in Diligent Community right now. It's about 118 pages of financial information, but that is available for anyone's viewing or consumption. So I'll reference certain sections in the document. So if you do get it, look out for those sections as you review the document. So a couple statements of fact. So the district for a very long time used the same auditor to audit our financials. As many of you know, we are required to produce an annual audit every year. That annual audit goes to the state. That annual audit also goes to the federal clearinghouse, so entities like the United States Department of Education, United States of Labor have access to that document. So it goes to the state and it goes to the federal clearinghouse. So every year, mandatory annual audit. That annual audit looks at the fiscal operations of the district. It also looks at certain things that the state chancellor's office requires us to do. So you may or may not be aware, there's actually a handbook from the state chancellor's office that is related to the kinds of things that we get audited on and the kinds of policies and procedures you should have in place. So that's a little bit of background information about the audit. So last multiple years, more than a decade, the district used the same auditor. When we had our new CFO, Melissa Thornsberry, come on board as the permanent CFO, Melissa and I had a conversation and believed it was in the best interest of the district to find a different auditing firm. Typically speaking, and probably not surprising to many of you, that you should always look for new auditing firms every several years, because what you don't want is the same firm continually auditing your organization, regardless if it's public, private, profit, nonprofit. It's a sound business principle to always, at a certain point in interval in time, switch auditors. So we did that this year. The auditing firm that we're now using is called CWDL. CWDL audits more than half of the community colleges in the state of California. So CWDL has a very rich history of working with community colleges in our state and conducting audits. The firm that we just left, we were actually the only remaining community college district that they audited. So for the last at least 5 to 7 years, in their cadre of clients, we were the only community college district. So the way those controls were done over the last several years were very different than the controls and tests that CWDL did. And so for 20 years, the district had what was called a clean audit. And that's very simply defined as a clean audit means there were no findings, okay? And findings means that the auditor has found something that could be a material weakness, could be a significant deficiency depending upon the type of issue that's been identified. So for 20 years, the district has a quote unquote clean audit. In other words, the auditors didn't find any issues with the district's financial statements or any issues with how the district complied with audited items from the state chancellor's office. So new auditing firm comes on, conducts very different sets of tests. So the tests that CWDL was performing on our financials were different and much more thorough than the tests that were being performed over the last several audits. So what does that mean? The issue is that CWDL identified several areas as findings. And so for the first time in more than 2 decades, the district had 10 findings in the audit. So let's talk quickly about what that means and what that doesn't mean. The findings are material weaknesses, and that's essentially defined by things that need to be fixed. If they're not fixed, they become what's called material deficiencies. Whenever you have material deficiencies in an audit, one of the things it can do, it can affect your organization's credit rating. As a district, we currently have what's called a AA- credit rating. For a nonprofit, that's about as high of a credit rating as you can get. The reason why that matters is, just like you and I as consumers, our credit rating affects our ability to borrow money, to enter into bonds at more competitive rates. And so our credit rating matters just like our credit rating as individuals, our combined FICO scores. The district's credit rating matters when we look at the future value of credit. So if you have findings that essentially become material deficiencies, then that can affect credit ratings. It can affect your ability to garner grants. So we don't want any time, any place for those things to rise from findings to material deficiencies. So we had 10 areas that were findings. And so what I'm going to do is provide kind of an overview of that. And again, if you are looking at or you download the actual audit itself, all of this, I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if it's not quite correct. I believe it's page 88 starts the audited corrective actions and the findings. So if you look at the audit, the very last section is what's called findings and corrective action plan. So I'm going to be speaking to the findings and the corrective action plan. So to give you a couple of things that the auditors looked for, one of the things that the auditors did was they performed a test on I-9s. And you might remember and recall that I-9s are the verification of employment. So every one of us who is employed by anyone in the United States has to be able to provide documentation that we are legally allowed to work in the United States. Whether we're a citizen, we're here on a permanent visa, whatever the case may be, we're required as employees to provide documentation. The employer is then required to ensure that all of those documents are met and properly verified. So what happened was CWDL did a test. They looked at 36 random files. Those random files could have been employees that were hired 15 years ago, could have been hired 5 years ago, could have been hired 30 days ago. So in the control, they looked at 36 employment files. Out of 36 employment files, they found that 20, or about 53% of the test, were missing required I-9 information. So they may have been missing a signature on the I-9 page. Maybe they were missing a copy of a driver's license or a passport. The issue with that is that not only is that a control issue, if the United States Department of Labor decided to do what's called an I-9 audit, organizations have been and can be fined for incomplete I-9s. So an incomplete I-9 as an organization can lead to a fine. Doesn't happen in every occasion, but nonetheless, you open yourself up for liability that you didn't necessarily need to have. And that's not an indictment about human resources. It's not to say they didn't do their jobs right. It's really systemic. There wasn't the kind of check and balance in place over the years to ensure that I-9s were completed, the forms were signed, people provided the appropriate documentation, again, such as a driver's license or a passport. So every single finding, that's one of 10, every single finding has what's called a corrective action plan. The corrective action plan is management's response to the auditors and the findings. The important thing to know about a corrective action plan in any organization is any auditing firm can look at a corrective action plan proposed by the organization and say, yes, we believe that this meets the requirements to address these findings, or there's some things here we think will work, but there's some other areas as auditors that we have some concerns about. Or they can say, you know, this plan is not definitive enough to meet the findings that are in here right now. So the issue is that when we look at this, auditors needed to look at the corrective action plan and say, yes, we believe that this actually is appropriate, it's timely, it's efficient, and it addresses all the issues that have been identified in the audit. So when you look at the audit and you look at the findings, there are pages, and if somebody just put it on there, I was right about page 88. So I was thinking that was the correct page. So on the audit findings, again, you'll see the corrective action plan. During the board meeting yesterday, when CWL's senior representatives were there, they commented about the corrective action plan, and they said to the board that we believe the corrective action plan that's been identified is sufficient enough to meet all of the concerns that were raised in the audit. So in other words, the 10 findings, we believe the corrective action plan is sufficient to address that. There's some questions already about staff and the centralization we're going to talk about in a second. So I'll kind of address those separately. I want to go through a couple other things with the audit and explain kind of what we're doing, and then I'll get into the questions, because again, there's several questions about that. So the issue with the audit was, let's talk about I-9s again. How do you ensure that there's an appropriate check and balance, right? Human Resources does their job to onboard employees. Then what is an appropriate check and balance to ensure that some other entity inside the district is also verifying that? So one thing that has happened as a result of the audit, and in consultation with the auditing firm, CWDL, we made the decision to move the payroll function from Human Resources to Finance and Accounting. Many of you who have been with the district for some time might recall that several years ago, that purchasing was a part of Finance and Accounting. It was moved to Human Resources. And by the way, those are not dissimilar models, right? In many organizations like ours, payroll can be a function of accounting. It can also be a function of human resources. So it isn't necessarily a right or wrong placement. We're in a situation where we felt like we needed to demonstrate to the auditors and the governing board, who is the ultimate fiduciary agent for the district, that we had the proper control in place. So the movement of payroll allows us to do this. Payroll will be the last check on I-9. So in other words, HR performs the onboarding and enrollment in employment forms, all the verifications. Payroll then essentially serves as a final verifier before somebody receives their first paycheck. The other thing we'll be doing is we will be going back and looking at all of our personnel files to ensure that everyone who's an active employee, full-time, part-time, whatever classification they might hold, that we have the appropriate I-9s in those files, they're signed, and they have the appropriate documentation. Because right now, I mentioned earlier, out of the test, and you'll see that in the audit, by the way, that 20 out of 36 didn't have all the appropriate signatures or the appropriate documentation. In order to avoid that situation by moving payroll, payroll becomes separate from human resources creating an appropriate check and balance. So when payroll looks at it, they're under a different area vis-a-vis finance and accounting, and payroll can essentially say, yes, Stephen Bloomberg's I-9 is complete. He's signed the form, he's provided his driver's license, he's provided copies of other documentation that he needs to provide. That way, the auditors can see that, and they can see that that is a proper control, proper check and balance. By the way, during next year's audit, the first thing the auditors will do is they will look at these 10 findings. They will then conduct additional tests to see if we are in compliance with those findings. Part of the reason why we've made changes so quickly is you may be aware that the interim audit actually starts in about 90 days. The interim audit actually begins in April. And so we have a very brief window to address the findings before the next audit starts. In fact, when you look at the corrective action plan, you'll note that each corrective action plan has a timeline to implementation. Some of those are 30 days, some of those are 60 to 90 days. I believe there are some that are up to 6 months. The point is we needed to show the auditing firm and the Board of Trustees that we understood the scope of the problem and we applied the appropriate remedy. In other words, there's some things we can take care of in 30 days. It's not going to take us 6 months to look at I-9s and make sure that all of that documentation is there and is appropriate. So some things we can take care of very quickly, and because we move payroll, we can ensure that that doesn't happen moving forward. So the second sort of bigger bucket, if you will, on the financial side of the audit was things to do with, let's just say, purchasing and accounting. So if you're reading through the auditing report or you read it, you'll note that in one of the findings, the auditor said, you know, there are multiple occasions where somebody procured a good or service and the requisition or the purchase order didn't happen until after the goods or services were consummated. So in other words, the PO should have been done, as we all know, up front. The issue with the situation in several instances was during the tests, that wasn't always true. So in other words, we provided a service, a vendor provided a service or a product, and the proper forms weren't in place prior to that time. So that person wasn't authorized to do business with the district. There's liability that can come out of those situations. And so the auditors flagged that as a finding because, again, as we know, there should be a purchase order in place. That should be done prior to goods and services being garnered. So what's the fix for that? So let's talk about what we have done for many, many years. As most of you know, we have an accounting function on our campuses. The accounting function reports to the district finance and accounting area. So there's from 3 to 5 individuals on our campuses that comprise our accounting departments. One of the controls that we're putting in place is we're going to move to a centralized accounting and purchase order function. So that means that those positions will return to the district office. We will centralize all of that. We'll centralize the issuance of purchase orders. There's a thing called a service level agreement, or SLA, that our finance department will enter into with each of our colleges. And an SLA, there's an example of an SLA. It may not be in the audit. That may not be true. A service level agreement is essentially an internal organization's department's promise to its other entities. So a service level agreement in finance and accounting might look like, okay, you submit a request for a PO. Within 48 hours, that is acknowledged, it's moving through the system. There are specific processes that a service level agreement addresses. So constituents, because again, the district is a service-based organization, constituents know that purchase orders are going to be done timely, that there's not going to be a delay. Travel, by the way. If you travel, you know that it can take a significant amount of time to be reimbursed for travel. By moving to a more centralized system, we should be able to cut down the times in which travel reimbursements are done. The other thing is, if you know, again, going back to the fact that we have accounting staff on each campus, those staff are dedicated to that institution. Centralizing everyone allows all staff to address issues at all colleges. So let's say that there is a significant need at Porterville College that may exceed the volume or capacity of accounting staff that were on that campus. We can then dedicate additional resources much more efficiently to address those needs in real time. Same for Saracoso Community College, same for Bakersfield College. Centralizing it gives us the opportunity to have a cadre of individuals who can serve at the same level all three of our institutions. The other thing that it does is it provided confidence to the board and provided confidence to the auditing firm that we were putting the appropriate checks and balances in place, so purchase orders were done timely. Purchase orders were done before goods or services were procured. And so as you look at the findings, some of them may seem like, well, maybe that's not that big of a deal. For example, there were individuals who have been issued district credit cards and there wasn't a signed card member agreement on file. I think there were 3 or 5. There was a very small number of individuals. And you might say, well, that's not that big of a deal. That's only a few people. So one of the issues here is that if we don't address the tests, we don't know how many other instances are occurring. So remember when I said we had clean audits for 20 years. Those audits weren't looking at and conducting the same kind of tests that CWDL did. And so we don't know how many past instances over the years that if those tests had been applied properly, there would have probably been findings in the past. So the issue is that even though some of the numbers may be small, it still indicates a systemic issue. And so the work that we're doing related to the audit is not a people issue. It's not a person issue. It's not somebody not doing their job correctly. I want to be really clear about that. It's a systemic issue, meaning the systems that we use, the processes that we use. Many of the things we do as a district are manual. When we take time off, we use Adobe Sign, but that is a manual process. We need to modernize our business operations. We need to modernize the use of the banner module in places like human resources. We need to modernize our processes so we're more efficient and effective, and things are not waiting forever to be approved, or people are not waiting for a very long period of time to have a question resolved with a financial issue. And so the root of all this is with the audit, it is an opportunity to become more efficient and more effective. In order to do that, yes, we have to make some specific changes to make things more efficient and effective. One of the things that I have directed from finance and accounting is to make sure that our constituents have input. If processes aren't working, then we just need to know. We need to know what we need to fix so we can take care of that expeditiously. This process over the next several months should allow us, when we emerge, to more timely address issues on our campuses, to be more efficient and effective as a district operation. So know that there's a lot of change coming. That change was very intentional. The change had to occur over a very short period of time. After we returned from the holidays, we had about 2 days to author the corrective action plan, get that to the board finance and audit committee so they could see it in advance, get that to the auditors in advance so they could see it, and if they had any recommendations for change, then there would be a conversation between myself, the CFO, and the auditing firm. Again, the auditing firm accepted our corrective action plan without any comment, without any reservation. So that's a good thing, but it also means that again, we've got a lot of work ahead of us, and we've got a lot of lifting to do to make sure that we really are more efficient and more effective. So I know that we've hit the limit on questions, so I'm going to start going through these because I want to start in the next 30 minutes, be able to answer as many as I can. So I'm going to shift to the questions. And again, as I always do, I'll read the first question. I'll read each question and give you the answer. Got to have a little bit of coffee. So the first question is related to the business office centralization matter. How many additional staff will the district be hiring to ensure that urgent orders are placed in a timely manner? And what is the expected turnaround time for purchasing? So let's talk about that for a minute. So with the centralization, as many of you may know, we have positions on our campuses called assistant directors of accounting. As we look at those positions and we look at changing some of those positions, we probably won't greatly increase the number of individuals, but by centralizing everyone, we will become much more efficient at serving all of our colleges. One of the things you might recall from a year ago when we were talking about the budget for this year, I was very interested in a position called a buyer. Buyers are people who work in a large organization and are able to secure goods and services at a very discounted rate. So I think one of the things that we'll do is look at the potential of changing some positions and having buyers installed. So that way, if there's bulk purchasing we need to do, that bulk purchasing that may be happening in isolation at each of the campuses for the same good or service, that we're doing it in bulk, saving the district money, in many cases saving tens of thousands of dollars, and many times, as you might suspect, buyers actually are able to cover their salary in the savings they get through buying in large quantities. That doesn't preclude campuses from having purchase orders with local vendors or other vendors of choice. To be very clear about that, the district is not saying everything's going to be bought through a bulk enterprise. You can still use the vendors that you use. In fact, as a district, we want to support our local small businesses. As you know, we use lots and lots of small businesses throughout our entire service area. That won't change. We'll still have the same relationship with our small businesses. It just means that for larger purchases and more bulk items, we can purchase things with the purchasing power that we have, the need that we have, at a much lower rate. So with those things coming to the district, the other thing you'll see is, again, the service level agreement. So there's a draft service level agreement document we're working on right now that we'll be sharing out with everyone. That service level agreement will talk about the very specific timeframes in which you can expect a PO, in which you can expect processes to unfold. Those are going to be very clear through a service level agreement with everyone. And that service level agreement is literally with each constituent, meaning each team member, each employee throughout the district. So again, you have a document that codifies the turnaround time for all of these things. There's no question about, well, when's this going to get done, right? When are my things are urgent to me? How do I know they're going to be taken care of? The service level agreement allows us to commit to you as our consumer, as our customer, because the district is a service-based organization, our service commitment to you. I'm going to move on to the next question. I think this is about our new Vice Chancellor. Will she work towards actual interest-based bargaining utilizing a non-paid facilitator? The use of a district-paid facilitator effectively cancels out the interest-based nature of the bargaining, and this needs to be rectified immediately for both faculty and classified as well. So a couple different things. We are in the midst of CCA negotiations right now. Gina Duran is the lead on CCA negotiations. Because we're in the middle of those negotiations, Dr. Medlin will be present to support Gina. Gina will finish the CCA negotiations because, again, it's difficult to switch chief negotiators halfway through. With our CSEA bargaining units, because bargaining is getting ready to start, Dr. Medlin will be the lead negotiator for the district at the bargaining table. Dr. Medlin and I have not talked about a district paid facilitator, either pros or cons. So she and I have not talked about the continued use of a district paid facilitator. Dr. Medlin, in her role as Vice President for Human Resources at College of the Canyons, was a chief negotiator for the college. And by the way, she was a chief negotiator in interest-based bargaining for both faculty and staff. And so I think when you are at the bargaining table with Dr. Medlin, you're going to see a very purposely driven individual who understands interest-based bargaining, who very intimately understands the relationship between the district bargaining team and the chapter bargaining teams at the table. And so I would say that we don't necessarily need to have a paid facilitator, but I'll also talk to Dr. Medlin about that. But my directive to her is that she lead the bargaining for our CSEA chapter units so we can get that underway as quickly as possible. Great question, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question is, what feels like decades ago, Bakersfield College underwent a branding update. Service units were promised that outdated branded items like tablecloths and pop-up tents would be provided new items. We sent these items to marketing, but have yet to receive any items or updates, or if there's still an intention to provide these items, is that rebranding effort halted? Let me tell you what I think I know. I think that BC's branding efforts are done. I think that is finalized. All the rebranding has occurred. The new brands, as far as the logo and different things, are in place. Insofar as the change to different materials like swag, stuff we all get, or tablecloths or tents. One of the things that we want to do is ensure that everything that we do reflects the current branding standards of Bakersfield College. So that process, as far as I'm aware, wasn't halted. It was completed. I will follow up with the campus PIO office and ask the question about where that is in the process, and as far as different departments needing the different branding items, again, like pop-ups. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? If you're in outreach or recruiting or student life, for examples, then having similar branding that matches the college's new branding for reasons we all understand is critical. I will follow up with the campus to make sure that I get you the answer to that question. But as far as I'm aware, branding campaigns concluded and that it wasn't halted for any reason. Is there an update on the 2025 KCCD climate survey? So our institutional effective office, I think, did a climate survey. I have not seen the results from that survey yet. You might know that Dr. Emma Blackthorne, our Associate Vice Chancellor for Institutional Research, has been doing a lot of specific work on wellness. You might have participated in a wellness survey that we did in late spring, and then focus groups over the summer. We're kind of working through some issues that have come from the wellness survey to address those. I'll talk to Dr. Blackthorne about the 2025 climate survey and get you the specific answer to that question. The next question is related to the business office centralization matter. Is the district aware or prepared for grievances related to the centralization and the manner in which it's being handled? I would say that from the district's perspective, our employees and our bargaining unit employees, as part of the CBA, absolutely can file a grievance. And so if the question is a district prepared? I think we're always prepared because we understand that there could be a grievance filed about a multitude of items. And so if there is a grievance about the centralization and or the manner in which it was being handled, then certainly, like any other grievance, that will be taken seriously. We will adjudicate the grievance just like we do any other grievance. I would just kind of comment about the urgency in which this needed to be done, the work that needed to be done in a very short period of time to ensure that the proper checks and balances were in place. Understand that that was a very significant shift that happened very quickly. And I also understand that there could be some grievances arising out of it. So again, to answer the question, if somebody says, are we prepared? We're always prepared for our employees to exercise their rights under the collective bargaining agreement. And if that's a grievance, again, just like with any other grievance, that will be promptly and properly adjudicated. So the next question is, I'm seeking clarification regarding how starting steps are being determined under the new salary schedule. I think this is probably management salary schedule. When the new schedule was implemented, many members of management were informed that individuals new to a position would begin at step one. This guidance was communicated to us by Abe following a situation in which several managers were moved down 3 to 4 steps as a part of the transition. However, it appears that this has not been applied consistently. There are multiple instances in which new hires are starting at significantly higher steps, including cases where individuals have little and no prior experience in the role. This discrepancy has raised concerns and has been discouraging for those who are negatively impacted by the original changes. I would appreciate clarification on the criteria being used to determine starting steps and whether the original guidance has changed. Understanding this would help address concerns and ensure transparency. So just to kind of summarize that quickly, you might recall that for more than a decade, our management salaries had not been reviewed. Under my leadership, we undertook a new management salary study that consequently resulted in the board approving a new salary schedule for management that significantly increased management salaries from the old schedule to the new schedule. So for example, most individuals coming from old schedule to new schedule received at least a 10% increase based upon the new contemporary schedule because the old one was out of date. So that's part of it. The next part is you go to this new schedule, right? And you have all these steps and all these ranges. In the beginning, to get everybody there, as is referenced in the question, everybody got put into a certain section in the beginning of that salary schedule. And now what we are starting to do is the Management Association leadership, Gina Duran and I met just prior to the holidays to talk about the issues that are being brought up here about looking at our internal employees who have been here and evaluating their proper placement on the management salary scale. I'm not sure if the association has, I don't want to speak for them, but there has been significant movement on this. The individual mentions a discrepancy and concerns. Absolutely. So when Gina and I and the leadership of the Management Association met, we agreed on a process that would ensure that people were moved to the appropriate place. We also agreed in principle on changes to AP, this is from memory, I think it's 7410. There's an administrative procedure that governs how this happens. And so that AP is going to be moving through the participatory governance process. So to the person who asked the question, as far as how does this work, how do we ensure this doesn't happen again, the AP has been adjusted to take care of the issues that you've identified. But I'd also ask the Management Association, if you haven't had the chance to have a discussion with your constituents about the recent changes, please do. But I'll also let anyone know that if you have further questions about it, by all means, please let me know. There's, again, been a lot of work to ensure that we have equity in the scale for individuals who have been here in positions and may have been at one step in range in the old scale and are still awaiting the proper placement in the new scale. But if that's not clear, or that's not apparent, or there's an issue you still don't understand, as I always do, please email me and let me know about your situation. But again, I can tell you there's been significant progress made with the association, human resources, and me, and all of that is codified in an administrative procedure that's very clear about addressing this so everybody knows. It's easier to deal with things when we know what it is, right? When there's an administrative procedure that's contemporary that any of us can look at and say, okay, I understand how this is being implemented in an equitable manner. Thank you for that question. Again, if you have a follow-up, let me know. There's another comment that says, is the district aware that centralization was attempted in the past and failed after 6 months? I was not aware of that. I can't speak to what was attempted, how the procedures were put in place, why it failed after 6 months. So I didn't know that. Thank you for letting me know. If you've got some information about that, I certainly would be interested to see it. I would suggest that because it failed in the past isn't necessarily a precursor to suggest that it's bound for imminent failure in the future. But my question would be, can we learn from that failure, right? Anytime something doesn't work out like we want it to, there's an opportunity for all of us, by the way, including me as chancellor, to learn. So if anyone has information about that, will you let me know? I'd love to have a conversation about kind of what happened, why did it happen? It didn't happen because of an audit finding, I'm guessing, but kind of what were the reasons? And again, if you know or have information, I'd welcome the opportunity to have a conversation. So to whomever said that, I didn't know that. Thank you. Somebody saying, where can we find the report? I think they're talking about the audit report. So if you go into Diligent Community, that is the next generation of board docs. There's a section in Diligent Community for the community. So anybody can see the board agenda. Anybody can see all the materials that are attached to the board agenda. So you can go into KCCD's Diligent Community, and the full 118 pages, don't quote me on that, but the full audit report is there. The entire document, you can save it, you can look at it, you can look at the corrective actions, you can look at all of the financial tests that were done. So the full audit report is contained in the board docs, or Diligent Community as we now call it. So it is available for anyone who wishes to look at it and review it. The next question is, does the current audit status impact current grant applications that have not been awarded? The good news is no. That does not impact any grant applications that have not been awarded. So the good news is, with findings that are not deficiencies, those don't affect our ability to continue with grants. They don't change our credit rating. They don't change a lot of our financial standings that could have a negative implication on our operations, whether it's grants, whether it is funding from the federal government or the state. So if there's a grant in progress, the findings in the audit shouldn't impact that grant. That should not be an issue. The next question is, the audit you have just discussed points to HR, Human Resources, and Student Services having some issues and some mild issues in business services. Really, we're going to have a meltdown and try to force people out of the smaller colleges because of that. Clearly, the KCCD no longer cares about employee well-being or campus culture. Also, HR hasn't done their jobs correctly for years. Anyone with a brain can see that. How many times are people's jobs built incorrectly? How many special comp agreements have been actively effed up by the DO? Perhaps this briefing shows a community that you, sir, actually are not capable of running this district, and we, academic senates, need to vote no confidence on you and your CFO immediately. As with any comment, I appreciate that. You obviously can make whatever choice or decision that you need to make. The choices we have made safeguard the district. The choices that we've made safeguard the financial status of the district. The Board of Trustees is in solidarity. The board agrees with all the steps that have been taken. Our auditing firm, CWDL, agrees with all the steps that have been taken. These are prudent financial controls that needed to happen. Obviously, everybody has their opinions about what those controls are or aren't. I understand that there's a lot of angst created. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, just like that individual was. I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your opinion. My job is to protect the integrity of the district in many aspects. That means the fiscal integrity and making choices that sometimes aren't popular, maybe aren't comfortable, but again, are necessary to preserve the fiscal integrity of the district. So I appreciate your comment. I understand your angst. If you want to have an individual conversation with me about it, as I've said since I became chancellor, I'm absolutely happy to do that. I'm always available. I'm here. It's up to you whether or not you want to have a conversation with me. But again, I appreciate your comment. The next question is, after reviewing the audit findings posted and the quick turnaround time for corrective actions listed in the report, what strategies, approaches do you intend to use to meet these deadlines? I hope we can capitalize on these opportunities to course correct on decentralized processes that hurt us from a business perspective. So I want to highlight one thing from there is the decentralized processes. In our conversations with the auditors, the issue is that some of these instances occurred because there were lots of things that were decentralized. The discussions we had with the auditors was about centralizing so we could avoid these in the past. So one of the things that you want to look at is in the corrective action plan, there are days, months, or weeks attributable to how we intend to address each one of those. In the coming days and weeks, we'll be communicating how that's going to happen. But for example, there are things that are going to be done to correct things like I-9s within less than 60 days. There's some things that are 90 to 120 days. So the first roadmap, if you will, is in the corrective action plan, clearly delineating the amount of time that we have to take care of these issues. But if you have some other questions about that, by all means, let me know. Next question, why do we need a contractor to do a search for a new president when we already have staff to do that work, I'm assuming in HR? So that's a really good question. We don't use search firms on every search, but like with many large organizations, large community colleges, large districts, large universities, there are search firms that we take advantage of from time to time to ensure that our search reaches the farthest possible points, that we garner the most effective pool. I'll give you an example. At Porterville College, we used a search firm called Academic Search. The number of applicants for that pool that met minimum qualifications, I believe, was 42 individuals. And so part of the reason we use a search firm, like again, many organizations, is to ensure that we have a significantly competitive pool. Yes, we do have people in HR that do this, but when we look at positions like chancellor, in some instances, vice chancellor, campus presidents, we will tend to look at a search firm just to extend the reach and to ensure that we have as competitive a search process as possible. HR continues to fill hundreds of positions every year and do that without a search firm. It's just that there are some specific instances where we believe that using a search firm allows us to have a further reach, and at the end of that process, a more competitive candidate pool. Thank you for the question. Next question is, at BC, there have been significant issues regarding the ad codes and managing enrollment during the first week of the semester. Do you have any plans to address these issues with Banner 9 at the district level? Yes, thank you for the question. So here is what I can say to you. I reached out to our Vice Chancellor for Educational Services. Heather Ostash, who's been working through a lot of these issues, Dave Barnett. I've had conversations over the last 48 hours with campus vice presidents of instruction and student services. What I'm going to do and what I've asked to have happen is that Dave Barnett, Chief Information Officer for the district, and Heather Ostash, Vice Chancellor for Ed Services, meet as they normally do with our vice presidents. You may be aware that Heather meets with vice presidents of instruction, vice presidents of student services regularly. I've asked Heather and Dave to convene a meeting of the vice presidents plus academic senate presidents or their designee to ensure that we have the right people at the table talking about the banner issues. Without getting into too much detail, there's some issues that we're having with ads. There's some issues that faculty are having with rosters that were capabilities that were in Banner 8 and not in Banner 9. Part of that is because of Banner 9 being a more web-based product. Our ability to customize is a little bit less in Banner 8. But yes, not only am I aware of the issues, but again, I've asked the vice chancellors to convene vice presidents of instruction, student service vice presidents, and either academic senate presidents or their designee, because we obviously want the faculty voice at that table to ensure that if there's concerns, people understand what's happening in the transition, what can happen, what can't happen. But I'm really glad you asked that question, because yes, that has been a significant concern just in the first week of the semester. There's a lot of work going on to try to address those concerns. The next question is, payroll has always had the responsibility to ensure I-9s are properly completed. If they have not done that, perhaps the lack of actual leadership since VC Davis was terminated from HR is the actual root cause. That could be. One of the things that we talked about with the auditors was that by moving payroll to a different area, it effectively created a line of demarcation. So it would be obvious to anyone, auditors, leadership, board of trustees, others, that payroll being under another area would be tasked with the final review of I-9s. And by being in another area, HR performs their onboarding functions. Under finance and accounting, then payroll would conduct the I-9 function. And again, as I mentioned earlier, payroll had been under finance and accounting several years ago. It was moved to HR. It may have been moved to HR under former, I think it's Vice Chancellor Tanya Davis, I think. That could have happened during her tenure, I'm not sure. But in our conversations with the auditors and looking at ways that we're going to provide confidence for the auditing firm and for the board of trustees that we were adequately addressing the issue, the summation of that was to move payroll, and again, creating a line of demarcation between the human resource onboarding function and the function of ensuring that I-9s are verified. I think we've worked our way through the questions. If you have any additional questions, let me know. Just in closing, let me say that I realize there's a lot of change happening right now. And I realize that change is creating angst. I realize that change is creating some uncomfortable situations. The change isn't happening for the simple reason of change. The change is happening because of the audit report. Again, I encourage you to read it. You will be operating from the same information that I have. I encourage you to read the corrective action plan. The dozens of hours I've devoted to having conversations with each individual board member and going over these issues and ensuring that they understood change was necessary to protect the district from future findings, to ensure that the current findings don't turn into material deficiencies. They're material weaknesses right now. What we don't want is material deficiencies. And so I understand that creates lots of angst. I understand that there's a very limited and contracted and compressed timeline to get it done. Everything was done in order to promote better service to our constituents. Everything was done to ensure that audits from here in the future don't have that issue. If you have other questions or comments about it, I'm always here, as I've been since the day I started as chancellor. I welcome everyone's opinion, whether that is in support, whether that is completely against, whether that is somewhere in the middle. I welcome the opportunity to speak with anyone about this. You can always have a conversation with me. I don't internalize comments. I don't respond negatively. I don't react negatively. I simply will have a conversation with you about the facts. I'll allow you the opportunity to do the same thing. I encourage you to reach out to me. I can't force you to sit down with me, but if you have significant feelings about something, as I've demonstrated in almost 2 years of chancellorship, I've never refused a meeting with anyone. I've never denied anyone the opportunity to meet with me, and they've always been very productive, collegial, professional conversations, regardless of it's a topic we may or may not agree. I just want you to know that none of that changes in the midst of all these other things going on. My commitment is still to serve our students at the highest possible level. My commitment is to serve you, our campus constituents, at the highest possible level, and I will do that every single day that I'm chancellor of this district. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you at the town hall meetings coming up in a couple months, so hopefully we'll be able to see you on campus, and if not, I will see you in the next webinar. I hope you guys have a great rest of your Friday. Good day, everybody.